How much do you know about the enslaved ancestors of the famous Jackson family? I'm Andre, and I'm a genealogist who helps people to discover their history. A couple months ago, I was scrolling on social media and I came across this post that was talking about Michael Jackson's paternal great great grandfather. It had all this information on there that was really fascinating. However, I noticed there wasn't information that was cited. There wasn't any person that was credited with providing this information on this post. And being a genealogist who's really interested in family oral history, as well as using the traditional records and being able to substantiate claims, I'm also really interested in DNA. So I wanted to see if I could find out any information about the Jackson family. I did start to do some digging, and I believe I found some records that give us a snapshot of the dispossession that the Jackson family's ancestors who were enslaved had endured, the violence of slavery that they had to live through. And I found stories that the family had passed down, as well as there was some or information that was found in DNA. So I put all this together and I wanted to share what I found. Here's part one of the story of the enslaved ancestors of the Jackson family. Let me tell you about July. This story starts off in what is now known as Clarendon County, South Carolina. On August 28, 1803, a Revolutionary War veteran, James Richburg, sat down and wrote his last will and testament. James wrote, "I give and bequeath to my beloved daughter Mary Gale 3 Negroes, Tenor, July, and Rose." This is the first recorded mentioning of the Jackson family's ancestor July, revealing that he was a slave of James Richburg. James Richburg was a patriot who had believed in the cause of independence from the British Crown. In order to do this, he, just like his peers, had used their status as colonial subjects and compared them to slaves. James and the other patriots used slavery as a basis to understand liberty and justice. Slaves embodying abject blackness provided a basis for these white males to imagine and create the United States of America. To paraphrase Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, slavery's existence crystallized the moral valiance of freedom and liberty. A contemporary of Richburg's was Timothy Ford, who wrote in Charleston, 1794, this: "Liberty is a principle which naturally and spontaneously contrasts with slavery. In no country on earth can the line of distinction ever be marked so boldly. Here there is a standing subject of comparison, which must be ever perfect and ever obvious. The constant example of slavery stimulates a free man to avoid being confounded with the blacks. Slavery, so far from being inconsistent, has in fact a tendency to stimulate and perpetuate the spirit of liberty." For the Patriots, it was not a contradiction to be a slave owner as well as fighting for freedom from the British Crown. Let's be clear. Slavery and the terror of dispossession and violence that slaves endured was the backbone foundation that the United States rested upon and continues to rest upon, as well as all these American concepts of freedom, liberty, justice, and democracy. James Richburg was intimately entrenched in the violence of slavery. His father's 1788 will reveals that James received a slave from his father, whose name was not even listed in the will, becoming one of 12 slaves that James owned at this time. In the 1800 federal census, it reveals that James Richburg had owned 23 slaves by this time. The extent of violence by James Richburg was revealed in 2023 when a Jackson family member, Thomas Jackson III, took a DNA test, and it revealed that James Richburg was the father of July. I do have to give a trigger warning. We need to understand that slavery marked the slave as sexually open and was thus violable. This is the world that made slavery possible. The sexual violation of July's mother occurred for no other reason, simply for the fact that it could. To quote Patrice Douglas, she writes, "The performance of the violation, the language of the non-injury, and the conceptual frameworks deputized to articulate the matter of what occurred are effectively muted by the disarrayed nature of this violence." A key feature of slavery that we also need to understand is natal alienation. This meant that any biological connection that July had with James Richburg, that connection did not get factored into the equation of what was constituted as family. Slaves did not have access to the rights of succession that an heir would. Subjects within civil society did have access to that, and they could be considered legal kin. The reality of this is seen in the last will and testament of James Richburg. He lists the children that he had with his legal wife as his heirs, and he wished for his property to be divided among them. And this included the slave that he fathered, July. His oldest daughter, Mary, was 17 years old at the time he wrote this. She had been married for about a year and a half, and she had just given birth to a daughter. And her father bequeaths his biological son to her. July was property, not a son, not an heir. James died in January of 1804. By the next month, an inventory and appraisal was done of his property. And after the pots and pans, a stove, were listed his slaves, and here is July's valuation. July was worth $106.25. He was 4 years old at the time. That is roughly today $2,213.54. So now, July's biological half-sister is his new owner. When Mary Richburg had married Josiah Gale prior to this, there was a legal process called coverture. This meant that Mary's legal existence as an individual was suspended underneath marital unity. This meant that her property was underneath him and his control. So when July was her property, Josiah was also the owner of July. In 1816, Josiah and Mary took July and the rest of their property from South Carolina to Amite County, Mississippi. A census was taken that year, and it reveals that Josiah Gale was head of household who owned 18 slaves, one of which was July, who was 16 years old at the time. Another one of these slaves was a young female girl named Jenny. The Jackson family's oral history was written down by Joe Jackson. He wrote it in a book that was published in Germany. In the book, he says that they descend from a slave girl named Gina. However, I cannot find any documentation of a slave named Gina that had any connections with July. I did, however, find out that July's owners, Josiah Gale and Mary Gale, owned a female slave named Jenny. I believe that she is an ancestor of the Jackson family. Let me tell you about Jenny. The first known mentioning of Jenny was when Josiah Gale wrote his will on May 16, 1828. He first wished that all his slaves be kept on the plantation, quote, with the stock of horses and cattle, and worked together until my youngest child becomes of age, end quote. He also wished that after each of his children married, his executors were to purchase, quote, one Negro apiece, male or female, as they may desire, end quote. Further, he wished that after his youngest child became of age, an equal division be made of all property, and that, quote, they first accounting for the Negroes they have received, except Jenny, which I give to my wife exclusively during her life, and after her death, then to be equally divided among the children. In piecing together the few scraps of information I found in the archives about Jenny, it seems that she was born sometime around 1820, which means that she was around 8 years old when Josiah Gale had bequeathed her to become the exclusive slave owned by his wife, Mary Gale. The intention was most likely for Jenny to be a domestic slave of Mary's. She would have been a chambermaid, a cook, a seamstress, somebody who would have tended to every whim that Mary Gale had at just such a young age. But we need to understand that slavery obliterates childhood. Joy James wrote, "Intimacy and bonding dissipated into the loss of childhood and motherhood as understood among the free. A slave child is a slave. A slave mother is a slave. Their social standing is obliterated by their captivity. Expressed in the concept of time means that there is no sacred time or protected time of Black childhood under white governance or colonialism or occupation or war. The time of captivity does not recognize childhood or motherhood as possessing unique rights other than those granted to the enslaved." By June 1828, Josiah Gale died. And in November 1828, an inventory and appraisal of all of Josiah's property was conducted. 43 slaves and their monetary value was recorded. 28-year-old July was worth $550. That is roughly $18,965.50 today. And young Jenny was worth $450. That's roughly $15,517.24 today. Remember that when Josiah wrote his will, he wished that all his slaves be kept on the plantation until his youngest child turned of age. To tie it back to July, it meant that his biological half-niece had to turn 14 years old in 9 years in order for her to have been considered of age, so that the rest of the slaves, including July, were to be divided up amongst all the children Mary Gale had. This meant that after his death, there was now a countdown to when things for July and the rest of the slaves were going to change. They could stay together for the time being, but in 9 years, it was going to change. What would happen when time was up? Who would go with who? Where would they end up? This violence of slavery, where there was no safety, this constant threat of violence that was threatening to tear them apart, living with the uncertainty of what was going to unfold. During the 9 years of waiting, more slaves were purchased on the Gale plantation, as well as slaves being born. It isn't known if July was the father, but we do know that Jenny gave birth to a daughter named Sally in 1833. Eventually, the day came in September 1837. The total number of slaves on the Gale estate was 78, excluding Jenny and her daughter Sally, since they were exclusively Mary's property. July and the rest of the 78 slaves were now going to be divided up. If July was in a relationship with Jenny and he was the father of Sally, there was no guarantee that he would be with them. 2 months after Mary and Josiah's daughter became of age, the executors of this state divided all the slaves into lots. 8 lots in total were created. These lots contained a number of slaves from as low as 3 to as much as 11. And these lots were created with the value of each slave, as well as how much of a share of the estate an heir would be inheriting. July was valued at $900. That's roughly $31,308.03 today. The records reveal that since Mary was Josiah's widow, she was going to draw the first lot, and in her lot was July. Since Jenny and her daughter Sally were the exclusive property of Mary, when she drew the lot that had July in it, it meant, just so happened to mean, that July and Jenny could be together. July was still owned by his biological half-sister. 7 of Mary and Josiah Gale's children drew their lots, and the rest of the slaves were all divided amongst them. We need to talk about what the division of slaves did for white people. I don't mean how they were practically inheriting property that was bequeathed to them. I'm talking about what it was doing psychologically in the psyche of white people, what it was doing for them. The division of slaves was reinforcing for white people that they were humans who had access to connections and kinship. The structural relation that black folks had to those who were human was an antagonism that expelled subjecthood and forced upon them objecthood, to paraphrase Frank Wilderson III. Meaning there was a coherence that was being given to white folks through the division of slaves. It was giving them a sense of what family was. It reinforced that they had ties to an ancestor, someone who died. They had a connection that was worth honoring and being respected. Black slaves do not have that. In fact, they have no capacity for relationality. Therefore, there's no ties worth honoring and respecting legally. Being an heir confirmed and affirmed their connection to the deceased, as well as their connections with one another as co-heirs. They and they alone have legal access to this person and can benefit from it, and slaves do not. On Mary's plantation, cotton was the main crop that they exported. In 1837, 41 bales of cotton were sold. One bale of cotton weighs about 500 pounds. This was over 20,500 pounds of cotton. The next year, 53 bales of cotton were sold. That's 26,500 pounds of cotton. It was very likely that July was one of the many slaves making this crop possible for Mary Gale. We know that Jenny went on to have 2 more daughters. Missouri was born around 1838 and Amy was born around 1840. And around 1845, she's listed as having given birth to a son named Nero. Jackson family oral history, later records, as well as DNA all confirm that July was the father of Nero. Since Jenny was a slave of Mary Gale, the law said that any children that a female slave gave birth to had also inherited her social status of slave. Nero was Michael Jackson's great-grandfather who was also a slave. By 1850, Mary Gale owned 23 slaves, including July, Jenny, and Nero. The government had something called a slave schedule, listing slave owners and the ages and genders and color of the slaves that they owned. No names are written, but based upon what we know, we can surmise that July is the 46-year-old mulatto male, Jenny is one of the 30-year-old black females, and Nero is the 6-year-old mulatto male. Later records reveal that Jenny went on to have 3 more children, Adeline, Jim, and Margaret. It is possible that July was their father. On January 26, 1856, Mary Gale wrote her last will and testament. She bequeathed, quote, certain Negroes, July, Sammy, and Adam, to her son James Richburg Gale. And this man, James Richburg Gale, did not live in Amite County, Mississippi. He lived in Point Coupé Parish in Louisiana. So just to recap, July was the biological son of his first enslaver, gets bequeathed to his older biological half-sister, and when his biological half-sister dies, she bequeaths him to her son. So he becomes the property of his biological half-nephew. Her will had no mention of Jenny, Nero, or the rest of her children. Keep that in mind. By March 1857, her will went to probate, meaning that Mary Gale had died. And as it did with every enslaver who died, an appraisal and inventory of all of their estate was conducted. July was around 57 years old at the time and was appraised to be $600, or roughly $23,031.17 today. Jenny and all of her children are not listed in this inventory and appraisal sheet. Keep that in mind. Where was Jenny? Where's Nero? Where are the other children that Jenny gave birth to? where were they going to go? Their absence was definitely noticed by Mary Gale's son, Lawrence. He soon after went before a court to ask the judge if he could become the executor and administrator of his mother Mary Gale's estate so that he can annex or amend the will to include Ginny's children. He wanted permission to be able to take Ginny's children and divide them up amongst him and the rest of Mary Gale's heirs. His petition reveals that sometime between 1853 and 1859, Ginny had sadly passed away. The language they used at this time was increase. So Ginny's increase included her 6 children, but this petition reveals that it also included her grandchild. Her daughter, Amy, had given birth to a son named Scott. So with Mary Gale now deceased, Lawrence Gale, her son, wanted Nero and his siblings and his nephew to be split apart from one another. The judge ruled in Lawrence Gale's favor, and on March 25th, 1857, Lawrence Gale wanted to see how much Ginny's increase was worth. The judge sent an appraiser to Mary Gale's plantation. He had to inspect each of them, evaluated their physical capabilities, assessed their future sexual capabilities for future increase, and placed a monetary value upon Nero, his siblings, and his nephew. Negro girl Sally, age 24 years, $1,100. Negro girl Missouri, age 19 years, $1,000. Negro girl Amy and child, age 17 years, $1,300. Negro girl Adeline, aged 9 years, $700. Negro boy Jim, aged 7 years, $550. Negro girl Margaret, aged 5 years, $400. And Negro boy Nero, aged 12 years, $800. That's roughly $32,580.72 today. Soon after this, there seems to have been some dispute as to who would have been considered an heir to the estate of Mary Gale. This delay, however, only postponed the inevitable. In the meantime, Nero became an uncle again when his older sister Sally gave birth to a daughter that she named after their mother, Ginny. On January 15, 1858, a second appraisal was done. Nero was appraised at $750. That's roughly $30,176 today. 11 days later, a militia of 5 white men came to the plantation because the day had come when Nero, his brother and sisters, and niece and nephew were going to be placed into lots and separated from one another. Sally and her infant daughter Ginny were taken to Lawrence G. Gale in Amite County, Mississippi. Missouri went to Emily S. Gale Johnson in Carroll Parish, Louisiana. Amy and her son Scott went to James Gale in Point Coupé Parish, Louisiana. Adeline went to Richard Gale in Carroll Parish, Louisiana. Jim and Margaret went to Sarah and Mary Conway, granddaughters of Mary and Josiah Gale, and they lived somewhere between Mississippi, Maryland, or Missouri at this time. And Nero was taken to Sarah E. Gale Coalfield in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. After losing his mother and having his father taken away from him, January 26, 1858, marked the date that Nero lost his sisters, his brother, his niece, and his nephew. He was now the property of his biological half-cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Gale Coalfield. This was a very clear example of the violence of natal alienation that the Jackson family's ancestors endured. The natal alienation of Black folks gives coherence to white people. There was no kinship ties among slaves that was respected and regarded legally, regardless of whether those ties were acknowledged by white people. The division of Ginny's children and grandchildren served the white Gales. It reified them. It gave them a sense of being. Bequeathing slaves to heirs in last will and testaments, inspections and appraisals of slaves, being the estate that gets divided up and given over to heirs, all served to reinforce that they were the humans who had access to kinship structures. The division of slaves were reminders that participating and benefiting from the structural denial of Black folks' access to kinship was how they were able to understand what family was. The violence of natal alienation that Nero and his family endured only meant that the white Gales were a family. It affirmed them as heirs. It confirmed their connection to Josiah and Mary Gale, and it affirmed their connections with one another as co-heirs. It solidified them as a family, keeping them intact and being able to function. His father, July, was now the slave of his biological half-nephew, James Richburg Gale, who lived in Point Coupé Parish, Louisiana. The 1860 slave schedule reveals that James Richburg Gale was the owner of 21 slaves, one of which is listed as a 56-year-old male. This has to be July. I couldn't find any records that discussed anything that had to do with July during the Civil War, but I did find this book revealing that in December 1864, Union troops of the 24th Indiana Volunteer Company were traveling in Louisiana on the lookout for a Confederate militia in Point Coupé. The Union troop arrived at James Richburg Gale's plantation and was greeted by one of his sons with bullets. He ran into the swamp while the Union soldiers camped at the plantation. Union soldier Benjamin Summers wrote, "A large number of hogs and chickens were gathered for the purpose of giving our boys a big Christmas, so they were appropriated as contraband of war." I'm sure July was there for this. This is a picture of James Richburg Gale's big house in Louisiana. I also couldn't find any documents regarding Sarah Caulfield's estate, the woman who now owned Nero. I do know that she lived 33 miles away in East Feliciana Parish, and she supposedly died in 1860. Although I could not find any documentation of the period when Sarah was the owner of Nero to the end of the Civil War in 1865, I did find a clue in the 1910 census record. The record gives a clue that Nero had been part of the Confederacy Army during the Civil War, but given the context of that Nero was a slave during this time, it's very likely that Nero was forced to labor for the Confederate Army. Joe Jackson did have some tidbits about Nero's life during that time. Joe Jackson wrote, "Nero had been sold to a plantation in Louisiana. He, along with the other slaves, had to eat and were told by the owners to kneel before a low trough, which he had to scoop with a spoon. Soon, Nero had enough of this and ran away. The owner of the plantation immediately sent people who searched all night long and caught the slave on the river miles away from the plantation. They beat up Nero so badly that he lost liters of blood. Some months later, when Nero recovered, his owner wanted to sell him, but slaves who had previously escaped were impossible to sell under the same high price. So instead, the owner decided to force Nero to work as much as possible. My grandfather was tormented on crude cotton fields of the South, held down on hands and legs. Once the fetters were removed, Nero dared again to run away. This time, the owner of the plantation himself headed a search group and appointed an award to the one who would catch Nero. He was afraid that other slaves would follow his example if he did not catch him. And when he finally tracked Nero down, he took a heated chimney nipper and squeezed his nose with it until Nero fell down. He left my grandfather to lie on the ground because he thought that Nero was dead. But he was so strong, and he had gone through this awful punishment. Those scars of the burn have remained with him up until the end of his days. I could not find any documentation to support this. However, these stories passed down within the family really speak to the gratuitous violence of slavery, and that how every wound that was inflicted isn't always written down in a primary source. By April 10, 1865, the Confederacy surrendered to the Union Army. Slavery was abolished in word, but the world that made slavery possible persisted and continues to persist to this day. Records after 1865 give us snapshots of how Nero was able to navigate or attempt to navigate the anti-Black world of Reconstruction. In November 1865, Mississippi was the first state to enact a set of Black codes whose purpose was to preserve white supremacy, control labor and movement, as well as civil rights of the newly freed Black folks. One of the civil rights that was given to Black folks was legally binding marriages. On the last day of the year 1868, Nero and a woman named Emmeline Dunn were married in Amite County, Mississippi. This reveals that Nero was able to get from Louisiana back to Mississippi. Not only that, it reveals that he utilized the last name Coalfield. Jackson family oral history says that July's nickname was Jack, and Nero was known as Jack's son, who later then used the surname Jackson. This record suggests that Nero utilized the last name Coalfield first, the last name of the last person who had enslaved him, his biological half-cousin. The 1880 federal census is the first record I could find where Nero utilizes the last name Jackson, so it seems that during his time of freedom, he was taking ownership of himself by choosing his last name. That same year when Nero was in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, July is listed in Amite County, Mississippi, and he utilizes the last name Gale, the last name of the last person who owned him, his biological half-nephew. This was the last record I found during July's lifetime referencing him. I don't know when he passed away, but family members say that he lived to be 104 years old, but I have not found any documentation to support that. Joe Jackson wrote that Nero would go out into the woods gathering herbs and creating medicines that he used to sell to people in the community. He wrote that he helped a lot of people and he ended up making a lot of money from this that he was able to utilize to purchase land in cash. This lines up with this 1888 deed that I found where Nero pays $100 for 117 acres of land in Amite County. This deed says that he was going to pay $77.38 over 5 years to pay off the rest of the land. But the catch is there was interest. By 1893, he owed $257.01. He had to put the land into a trust or else he risked losing the land. However, it seems that he was able to pay what he owed. Interestingly, that same year, I found that he had to go to court and was charged with perjury, but was later found not guilty. I was not able to find the details of this case, so I don't have much about that. In 1900, I found that he went into a joint venture with 2 other men to purchase land from a white woman named Fanny Smith in Amite County. They agreed to do 3 installments of $350 with 10% interest, all to purchase 280 acres of land. And they were able to do it. In 1906, Nero was able to have those 2 men pay him for land. In 1910, he's 65 years old and he's listed in the census as an employer, suggesting that he hired workers that he was paying. In 1920, he went into a 5-year lease agreement with the Texas Oil Company where they paid him $200 each year so that they could explore his land for oil. Joe Jackson wrote about this and said that the oil company made $1.2 million. It was definitely a lopsided deal, and that Nero should have gotten way more money for what he had signed that lease for. But this was sadly not the last time that Nero would be taken advantage of. According to his son William, by 1930, Nero was 85 years old and had to stop working the land. After a lifetime of agricultural labor, a skill he was forced to learn during his time as a slave, Nero's body began to physically fail him, and he was physically unable to tend to the land. He had his wife Emmeline as well as 2 younger family members who were able to be helpful on the farm, but Emmeline was in her late 70s by this time, and there was over 200 acres of land to tend to. There was only so much that they were able to do. Enter Carl Raymond Ewald. Ewald was a very powerful and wealthy white man in southern Mississippi. He was the grandson of a German immigrant who came to the United States with his brother to Virginia, who began a family enterprise. This family enterprise positioned Ewald's grandfather to become very important and wealthy within the community they lived in Virginia. Carl's father, John, was a Confederate soldier fighting for the South's insistence on anti-blackness. Carl's father inherited his father's business, his land, and wealth, and owned two slaves, all before Carl was born. Carl grew up in a very wealthy household during Reconstruction that had black and white servants. He took his share of his father's estate and went to Louisiana, where he married the daughter of a wealthy timber company owner, took his wealth and family, and established themselves in Centreville, Mississippi, which is in between Amite and Wilkinson counties in southern Mississippi. There, he helped establish the Farmers Exchange Bank and was the vice president. He also later became an alderman in Centreville, Mississippi. And with his wealth, he opened up the Ewald Mercantile Company. It positioned him to become the sole mercantile of the community. He supplied groceries, dry goods, clothing and hardware, and other necessities that residents and the farmers needed to survive. This was a very powerful person in the community. He had owned land of his own, trying his hand at cotton, but was put out of the industry due to boll weevils. In 1919, he switched over to peppers and had in 1929 over 2,000 acres of peppers in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. And he's recorded as saying that farmers who grew peppers had gotten out of debt by just utilizing 1 to 2 acres. He is recorded conveying his ambitions to convert more land in Mississippi where cotton was growing to peppers so that they can continually make profits off of this crop. This is the man that Nero and other farmers in the community had to depend upon for their survival. Because of his position within the community, he would have found out about Nero's situation and how he was unable to really tend to his farm. And sure enough, by 1931, he caught wind that Nero couldn't pay his property taxes. In 1931, Nero was forced to sell a vast majority of his land to Ewald just to be able to cover the debt he owed for his property taxes, all because he wasn't able to generate enough income to do this. This sale was in alignment with Ewald's ambitions. Prior to this, he had an established history of acquiring hundreds of acres of land owned by families, black and white. So to Ewald, here was this elderly old black man who was sitting on hundreds of acres of land that he was desirous of. Unfortunately, this was the perfect setup for Nero to have the land that he had worked so hard to attain, to care for, to tend to, with his blood, sweat, and tears, with everything that he put into it, and have it all be taken away from him. Remember, according to Ewald, he said that just 1 to 2 acres of land was necessary for a farmer to get out of financial ruin. This was what could have helped Nero, but that's not how he assisted Nero. Sadly, on July 23rd, 1932, Nero's wife, Emmeline, passed away. She was 78 years old and still trying to labor on the land that they owned, right up into the end of her life. Dependency upon Ewald grew. In March 1933, Ewald was able to acquire the land of Nero's former partners, his neighbors who lived around him. Ewald was now surrounding Nero and the little bit of land he had left. Joe Jackson wrote that Nero became feeble in his old age and had come down to the last of all of his money. He wrote that Nero had depended upon Ewald in his store and eventually became in debt to him, no longer being able to pay for what he needed for his survival. Sadly, in April 1933, Ewald was finally able to get all of the rest of Nero's land. Joe Jackson gives us a little bit more detail about how this occurred. He says that Nero's state caused him to, quote, hand over to Ewald for storage some important papers so he could keep for him. In the end, Ewald managed to appropriate documents on owning the farm, ostensibly as debt payments, which Nero owed him. The paper trail and the family's oral history line up, saying that Ewald got way more out of his dealings with Nero because it wasn't tied to his survival, it was tied to his greed. Sadly, Nero died in his home on October 12th, 1934, of senile debility, or physical and mental decline. This man, Nero Jackson, had lived 90 years in this anti-Black world. So these are the stories I found of the famous Jackson family. July and Jenny had Nero. Nero and Emmeline had Samuel Jackson. Samuel and Crystal Lee King had Joseph Walter Jackson. And Joe Jackson and Catherine Screws became parents to the talented, world-famous entertainers, the Jacksons.